Welcome to this skill acquisition in sport video. In this video, we are going to be thinking about sense and perception. So two key questions to answer then. What is perception to begin with? And then what factors influence how well we can perceive our environment? So let's get started. So what is perception? Well, this is my own definition, but it's a fairly standard one. I think that perception is the process by which the information received from the sensory organs is identified, organised and interpreted. The process by which the information received from the sensory organs is identified, organised and interpreted. Now, if I were to ask you to tell me what the senses are, you would probably come up with this list. So we often talk about the five senses, and the five senses are sight, smell, touch, hearing and taste. And these are all ways in which we perceive our world. So each of these enables us to take in information from the world outside, interpret it, organize it, and so on. So we have these five senses, but you're probably also aware that these days we don't limit our senses to just these five. And there's some debate as to exactly how many senses a human being has, but here are some others that you could consider. Balance is another perceptive sense. Temperature, you're able to tell whether or not you're hot or cold. Proprioception is your ability to figure out where your body is in space. Are you moving? Are you upside down? And so on. How fast are you moving? That sort of thing. We're able to experience and feel and sense pain. We can sense hunger and we can tell whether we're hungry or full. And also we have this inbuilt sense of the passing of time as well, which is why we sometimes hear ourselves say things like, oh, that went quickly, or that's really dragged, because we have a sense of the passing of time. So these are just a wide range of senses that human beings have, some of which, like pain and proprioception, for example, and balance, are particularly relevant for sport, and some less so. So, for example, the sense of hunger and the sense of taste may be less relevant in sport, but lots of these are relevant. Okay, let's talk about this idea of perception within the context of sport for a little bit. I'm going to focus on football or soccer if you're in the States, but you can really broaden this out to really any sport that you want to consider. And in fact, you can broaden this out to any existence in the world. But let's be specific. Let's talk about football and give some examples related to football. So let's say you're playing football, and you will obviously know whilst you play football, there's all sorts of stuff going on in your external environment. There's things that relate directly to the game and things that don't. There's things like the movement of the ball, the speed of that movement. There is the movement of your teammates, movement of the opposition. There are things that are incidental to the game, like the sound of the crowd, the size of the crowd, the sound of your coach's voice bellowing at you from the sidelines, the firmness of the ground underfoot. Is the pitch slippery? All these kinds of things, the weather as well, all these kinds of things are things that are going on in your external environment that are there, and potentially you can sense them. You have the potential to sense all these things going on in your external environment. And the way that you do that is through the senses that we've spoken about. Now, each of those senses can access, to some extent, access the external world, but can only store what they access for a very, very limited amount of time. And they store that information that comes in, they store that for a very short amount of time in what we know as the sensory store. Now, in terms of the amount of time we're talking about milliseconds. Very, very thin slivers of time that your body will take information in about what it's seeing, what it's hearing, about balance, and so on. And that information only resides in the sensory store for a very, very short sliver of time. So what happens next? Well, once this information about the stimulus, whether it's the ball or the pitch or the movement or whatever, or a combination of stimuli, once that information has arrived in the short-term sensory store, it needs to be selected from. If it's relevant, if that information is relevant, it is attended to by what we call selective attention. Selective attention. And this process of selecting from the sensory store the sense data that's relevant, this process is called detection. Detection. So of all this available information in the sensory store that's been gleaned from the outside world, we then use this process of detection whereby we select what's in the sensory store and we decide if it's relevant to focus on, we'll focus on it by passing it into our short-term memory. And if it's not relevant, we'll ignore it. And because the sensory store only stores for a very short period of time, it will ultimately then be lost. So into our short-term memory, this detected information is passed. And sometimes we refer to short-term memory as working memory. Working memory. It's where we manipulate, as it's the seat of our thinking, essentially. It's where we think about what we've seen, what we've heard. It's where we try and process and work through the information that we've taken in. So we've detected and we've selectively attended to certain senses and passed that information into our short-term memory. And one of the key things now that we believe happens once that information is in our short-term memory is we need to do something with it. So what we do with it is we compare it to previous experiences. We compare it to previous experiences. So in that sense, then, we have this idea of comparison where we compare what's in our short-term memory, the sights and the sounds and the feelings and the senses. We compare it with our long-term memory, things that we've experienced in the past, our existing understanding, our prior experiences. We compare the short-term memory with that vast experience of our long-term memory. And that's partly why the box for long-term memory that you see on the screen is such a large box, because in effect, as far as we can tell, our long-term memory capacity is, as far as all things considered are concerned, it might as well be infinite. Our short-term memory, however, is limited. So our short-term memory, with its limited capacity, will compare, it will make comparison with previous experience and previous understanding and previous outcomes that exist stored away in our long-term memory, and we call that comparison. So this detected information is passed to working memory or short-term memory, and then it's compared with our experience in the long-term memory. If there is something in that long-term memory, if information that we've detected, the senses that we've detected match something in our long-term memory, then we retrieve from our long-term memory something that will help us make sense of the senses that we detected. Now, I hope that makes sense. What that is called that's called the process of recognition. That we send this information, we offer up what's in our short-term memory, we offer it up against our long-term memory to see if there's something about the movement, something about the skill, something about what's happening in the game, something that we recognize from our previous experience. And if we do recognize some things from our previous experience, we pull that previous experience down into our short-term memory, into our working memory, and that then helps us decide what to do next. So this whole process of perception begins with sensing our environment. We pull in only the information that we want to selectively attend to from the sensory store. We compare that with our long-term memory to see if there's anything relevant there that can help us make sense of it. If we recognize things, we bring those things into our short-term or working memory, and as a consequence then, that will help us with our decision making. Or specifically, the correct term here would be our response selection. So the short-term memory then, the seat of our thinking, our actual conscious thinking, helps us then, having compared with the long-term memory, now it's going to help us decide what to do. So quickly to run through this, if the ball is coming towards your feet, you can sense it using sight predominantly. Your short-term memory will detect that information. It will selectively attend specifically to the movement of the ball, because that's the most important thing at that moment in time. It will compare it with previous experiences of a ball being passed to you. If you have any previous experiences, which is of course the point of training, if you have any previous experiences of a ball moving towards you at that speed, you will borrow from that, bring that down into short-term or working memory, and all of that together then will help you decide what response to make. Are you going to trap the ball? Are you going to flick the ball? Are you going to immediately pass the ball on, or what have you? And this whole process to take the information that exists externally out in the external environment and process it through detection, comparison, recognition, enables us then to make good decisions about how to respond in terms of our sporting movements. And you can apply that essentially to any sport, because in any sport the external environment is an important factor that has to be considered when you're deciding what movements and responses to make. Now then, there are several things that would influence perception. There are several things. This process of perception is not identical for everyone, and there are elements of it that can be changed or helped or hindered depending on a range of factors. So I'm going to just finish up this video talking about the factors that will influence how effectively we can perceive our environment. Because if we can't perceive our environment effectively, we can't then hope to make effective decisions about how to respond in our sport. If you can't see the ball coming towards you, it's hard then to control it or to pass it or what have you. So perception is it's absolutely vital. Perception is vital, and if we can improve the quality of our perception, all the better. So let's find out what influences perception, and then we can perhaps decide how we might train to improve our perceptive ability. There are I'm going to split them into two main categories of things that influence perception. The first one is external factors. So these are things in the external environment that either help or hinder your ability to perceive what's going on around you. So those are essentially features of the stimulus. So in the case of football, how big the ball is, what colour the ball, those sorts of things, the external environment that you're focusing on, how clear is it to you, how easily perceivable is it. So those external factors will influence perception, but also of course internal factors will influence perception, because once that sensory store has gathered some of that data, we've got various steps then, haven't we? We've got the steps of detection and recognition and so on, that will be determined by all sorts of internal factors, your own individual abilities, some of which are innate and some of which can be trained and worked on. So let's look at external factors first. So there are several external features or external factors that enable us to perceive a stimulus more easily. And I've put them on a bit of a continuum because they are essentially on a continuum. On the left-hand side, features of a stimulus that make that stimulus easier to perceive, and on the right-hand side, features that make it harder to perceive. And the first one is going to be to do with familiarity. So how familiar is that stimulus in that environment to you? If it's something that's familiar, and what I mean by that really is it's an expected stimulus in that environment. So for example, if you're playing football or soccer and the football comes towards you, that's relatively easy to perceive because it's a familiar environment for the football to be coming towards you. But if you're playing football and suddenly somebody throws a frisbee onto the pitch or a dog runs onto the pitch, it may take a little while for you to figure out what's going on because it's out of the ordinary, it's unexpected or unfamiliar. And this is also true with movements or plays things that are unexpected. And this, of course, is one of the reasons why dummies and sidesteps and turns enable you to escape from a defender. Because if you can lure a defender into thinking you're going to do one thing and then switch to something unexpected, it takes them longer then to perceive and process what's happened. And in a later video, we'll talk about that in more detail. So familiarity of the stimulus is a very key factor that affects how easy it is to perceive what's actually happening with that stimulus. There are several others. The speed of movement. So again, with the ball in football, if the ball is moving slowly, it's easier to figure out where it's going and so on. If it's moving quickly, it's harder. That seems quite straightforward. The loudness of a stimulus, the volume of a stimulus, if it's louder, it's easier to perceive, and if it's very quiet, it's much harder to perceive. As you know, that's obvious. Also, in terms of the colour and the colour contrasts, which is why in the winter in the UK, we will play with either a yellow or sometimes even a pink or orange football because of the colour contrast between those colours and the usual colour of a white ball. In the summer and in good light, then a white ball is perfectly good contrast. But in slightly duller conditions, in slightly darker and dingier conditions, especially if there's snow or rain, it makes life a lot easier for the players in terms of their perception, ability to perceive the ball, if the ball can have a high contrast colour. And then related to that, of course, is brightness. Where things are brighter, they're easier to perceive. Where they're dull, they're harder to perceive. And we can think back to the famous occasion where Manchester United wore their new kit, which was a grey kit, and had to change their kit at half-time because they were complaining that the players couldn't really pick one another out. And that's because the grey kit was so dull in comparison to the crowd and the goings on around on the pitch. So brightness and lack of brightness or dullness, the brighter something is, the easier it is to perceive. So those are some of the external features of a stimulus that might make a stimulus easier to perceive. Those are external to the human being, the player. But what about internally? Well, again, there's several internal factors or features that will affect how good our perception is. And I'm going to just focus on three really briefly and really simply. The first one is the level of attention. The level of attention. So each individual has a personal level of attention, both that is conscious and partly unconscious. The extent to which you're able to focus and really pin your focus on the stimulus that you're supposed to be focusing on. And of course, you know, if you've ever worked with kids in sport, often attention level can be one of those factors that kind of tends to slip quite easily. But when it comes to focusing on the game, following instructions, that sort of thing, if our attention level isn't there, we're going to struggle to perceive what's going on around us if we can't focus on it. So selective attention, being able to, and again, this is partly learned and partly genetic, as far as my understanding goes, is the ability to really focus in and shut out all the other goings on and focus in and selectively attend to those features of the external environment that are really relevant to you in your sport and in that moment. So attention level is really important. That's an internal factor. A second internal factor is arousal level. Arousal level. So that's the extent to which you are physiologically prepped and ready to play your sport. So have you been physiologically and to some extent psychologically prepped? Are you ready? Have you done your warm-up? Are you ready to focus? And these things are obviously linked together. So to what extent is that person physiologically aroused and ready to play? You know the state that we're all in when we wake up in the morning. Most of us take a little while to we're a little bit drowsy, and it takes us a while to figure out what day it is and what time it is and whether or not I can have another 10 minutes and hit the snooze button and so on. It's because our because our arousal levels relate directly to our physiological alertness, and our alertness has an impact on our ability to perceive our environment. And there's one more. So the third one is attentional capacity. And this really comes down to the role of the working memory, or the short-term memory that we looked at in that diagram. The short-term memory can only cope with a very limited amount of information at any given time. And so if our working memory, if our short-term memory is easily overloaded by too much information, that can help or in fact that can hinder our perceptive ability. So if we're trying to focus on too much, and this is linked in with the idea of selective attention. If we're trying to take in too much, we're trying to focus on too many things at once, our ability to perceive our environment starts to break down. And you know that from, learning to ride a bike or learning any new skill that's got multiple components to it. It's really hard to focus on all of the different elements that you're trying to focus on all at the same time and play the game. So if you're just learning, it's very difficult, not impossible, but very difficult to play the game unless there's, the coach has put some good conditions into the game. It's very difficult to focus on all the things you're supposed to be focusing on, and therefore it has an impact then on your ability to perceive the key information that would actually help you to perform well. So these three things relate together: the attention level, the arousal level, and your attentional capacity. And that third one, attentional capacity, is probably the one that's most linked to your genetic predisposition. Essentially the working memory capacity that you have is relatively, as far as we understand at the moment, we may change our understanding of these models in years to come, but as far as we understand at the moment, our working memory is relatively fixed. So we have to do the best that we can with it by making sure we don't consistently overload it. So those are some of the individual abilities, the internal factors that affect how well we can perceive our sporting environment. So that brings us to the end of this video. We've thought a little bit about our sensory store and how we access the external world, and then what we do internally to make sense of that information, to process it, to organize it, and to interpret it. And that whole process is what we refer to as perception. And if we're able to perceive the world effectively, then we can respond to it. If we're able to perceive the game that's going on around us, then we're able to respond to it more effectively. And essentially, in theory, makes us better players because we choose better responses, because we're able to read the game better. So sense and perception are absolutely crucial in sport. Some of it is genetically determined, but a good deal of it is stuff that you can work on and you can improve, both externally and internally. I hope that video has been helpful to you. Please don't forget to like it. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't done so already. Any questions? I know it's a complicated subject, so any questions, please put them in the comments and I'll get back to you on those. Other than that, enjoy the rest of your day. Take care for now. See you in the next video.